great compound question. I mean, the way I think about the future of Judaism in the United States is that 40% of the world's Jews are here, okay? 7 million are in Israel, the other 20% are scattered around the rest of the globe. And one of the incredible things about Judaism and Jewish identity is that we've been at it for more than 5,000 years. We know how to adapt. And the United States, as a nation that is both founded upon others, moved through with immigration, and structured around racialized stratification, it's not complicated to understand that the US Jewish community has grafted some of the same racism onto itself. Every community has racism grafted onto it because we are part of the United States. And so when I think about the future of the US community, it is not an intellectual exercise, it's just a matter of science and fact that we're becoming more multiracial. And so as a matter of survival, we have to become more anti-racist and more flexible and more adaptable and more elastic around issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, simply because that is part of the nature of our community here in the US. And because we are in a racialized context, racial diversity is complicated. And so we also have to recognize how difficult it is to move through and overcome racism. And when you have an entire community that, for part of our community, like I mentioned, didn't come to the US labeled as white, many people came fleeing atrocities and anti-Semitism into a country where it was a strategy of survival to assimilate. Racism and whiteness are complicated for US Jews. And so I think the future of the Jewish community, we know it's becoming more multiracial. It's also becoming more multi-ethnic. And if you look at the data, in some ways I would say it's in some ways becoming more multi-religious, because some Jewish community members identify as more than one faith, if you look at the Pew study, for example. And so when we look at what's in front of us, the future of the Jewish community requires us to be adaptive. It requires us to have a mindset of inclusivity and equity. And it requires us to have some courage to confront how racism has affected us so that we can figure out how to, in some ways, mitigate it, in other ways, create prophylactics from it because of the diversity of our young people. I'll end by saying, one of the reasons why the Jews of Color Initiative is in the business is because we're in the business of Jewish longevity and Jewish sustainability. And so at the end of the day, part of our work is about sustaining the survival of the US Jewish community, because as we become more multiracial, if we don't become less racist as an organizational structure, for example, what we're going to lose is our young people. And if that number is increasingly racially diverse, we have no options other to be able to adapt. And what's our organization's role in that? We work with leaders, funders, influencers, movements inside the Jewish community. We provide the data to help the community understand the diversity of the Jewish community. We provide the data about the experiences, perspectives, and beliefs of Jews of color. And we provide the data about how to keep Jews of color in general more engaged. The Jewish community has a large population of Jewish people of color who work inside the Jewish community. And so we also want to sustain our colleagues in that space to help create more opportunities for diverse leadership in the community, which is also really important. Okay, so first, if you're a data person, I want to strongly recommend you curl up with our study Beyond the Count, which gives you some incredible, not only the graphs and the data, but there's also narrative commentary of some of the respondents inside of there for you to hear their voices. In Beyond the Count, which is not a representative study of Jews of color in the United States, but it's a snowball study. And again, we have respondents from 47 states and Puerto Rico. Something like 2/3 of the respondents are Jews who either have one or two Jewish parents. I'm gonna say it again. Something like 2/3 of the respondents, I think it was 66 or 67%, have either one or two Jewish parents. And so it is a myth and a bit of a stereotype that most Jewish people of color in the United States are Jews by choice, conversion, or adopted. And in fact, the majority of Jews of color in the United States, according to the data, are just from like mixed parentage. And one parent happens to be Jewish, and then that parent becomes an adult, and then that child becomes and then they marry somebody Jewish, and now you have two Jews of color having a baby. And so it's a bit of a stereotype, and I want to caution us around thinking about Jews of color as Jews by choice or converts or even as adopted, because when we have that mindset, it often comes from an othering, or they can't be Jewish the same way we're Jewish. And every time we see somebody different, I know we want to track how they are connected to us. And so I love that question because it dispels the stereotype. So thank you for whoever asked that. Okay, so first you all know that there are denominations, but the boundaries are porous. And so I just want to say, for the sake of this conversation, I don't even want to fully concretize the construct of the denominations, because the Jewish denominations across the United States are very diverse and very flexible. But I know what you're asking. On average, many Jews of color are found in the Reform movement. And part of that is because the Reform movement, by 1972, I think, was ordaining Jewish women, and at some point allowed for interfaith families. And so if you were going to have a situation where you had one Jewish parent, the Reform movement was a natural pathway for a diverse family. I would say, like, inside of the Reform movement, and the Reform movement constitutes something like 60% of the organized, formally affiliated Jewish community, I would say, like, maybe half of the Jews of color we've surveyed are part of the Reform movement. Very, 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 very few are part of the conservative or Masorti movement, and a great number are part of the modern Orthodox movement, with another kind of swath of Jews of color who are part of the Chabad or the Black Hat movement. And so, if you go on our website, there's an organization called Kamocha, and that's for Black Orthodox Jews. And so, yeah, and I'll say one more thing about that. Another way to come at that question, and it's different but the same, is someone asked me once, which denomination is most racist? The way I want to answer that, connected to what Melissa asked, is one of the things we found, more anecdotally, but I would say it's almost a data point, is there's more rigor around considering and trying to dismantle racism we have found in the modern Orthodox and Orthodox communities because of the adherence to Torah and kind of the rigor that comes when one is a text scholar and their Jewish identity is based in Torah and text. We find the most interpretive version of Judaism in some ways with the Reform movement, because I was raised Reform, and so Rabbi Jonah Pessner and Rick Jacobs, forgive me, there's not that much text study. And so there's a lot of good Jewish values, but you're raised to interpret the values rather than to root the values in text. And so we find that in our observant communities, there seems to just be more rigor, more structure to grappling with racism, and wanting that grappling to be rooted in halakhic text, in Jewish law and Torah. So first I'll say, for the Jews of Color Initiative, we are a US-based, US-focused organization. And I will share with this group that when I helped found the Jews of Color Initiative and we were trying to decide if our scope was going to be domestic or international, I'll be really honest. I was like, I don't want to deal with international politics. And so we tightened our focus to domestic, in some ways as a buffer from dealing with international politics. And it was actually rather smart until, So as an organization, the way we fight anti-Semitism is we help build, develop, and fund leaders in their organizations who are Jews of color who want to fight anti-Semitism. Or we make grants to organizations developing pedagogy programs, entire movement-based activities around resisting anti-Semitism. And for us, what's beautiful about it is, and for example, we're going to do a grant round starting next month focused on fighting anti-Semitism. It's going to be rooted in being led by and for, in partnership, but led by and for Jews of color. So what's important to us is that when we're fighting anti-Semitism in the United States, one of the problems that we have inside the Jewish community is we forget there are people of color. And so when we're fighting anti-Semitism, sometimes the way we fight anti-Semitism can have a tinge of anti-Black racism in it. And the way we talk about like Black people are more anti-Semitic than white folks, when there's no data to support that. And so for our organization, what we do is we help fund and create models that understand the US is diverse, and that if we're gonna respond to anti-Semitism, we have to be able to respond to it also by fighting racism. And as the US becomes more diverse and the US Jewish community becomes more diverse, it's even that much more important that we actually have the pedagogy to fight anti-Semitism and racism at the same time. Because otherwise, you're going to be forcing people of color who are Jewish to choose which battle we're taking on. When this room, we know the white supremacists, the white nationalists are coming after all of us, right? They're not going to differentiate between who's Black and who's gay and who's Jewish and who's Muslim. They're coming after all of us. So we have to coordinate ourselves together and learn how to fight together. It also means that we're going to have to understand each other better. So where anti-Semitism does come up in communities of color, around stereotypes or anti-Semitism in that way, we have to stand up to that, and we have to resist that, and we have to speak out against that. But we also have to speak out against when Jews perpetuate anti-Black racism in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. So first, I think I want to challenge the frame of the question about people of color in general kind of naturally aligning with one side or another. There is an enormous amount of racial and ethnic diversity in Israel. There's enormous racial and ethnic diversity inside the US Jewish community. And what the data tells us is the perspectives of Jews of color are as diverse as the perspectives of white Jews. And so, we know that there are Jews right now who are feeling very Zionist. We know that there are white Jews right now who are feeling very anti-Zionist. And we know that there's people in the middle. And that continuum grafts onto all of the racial diversity of the Jewish people. And so by extension, I know, because I work with the media and I study these things, I know that there is an impression out there that communities of color are less pro-Israel or less supportive of Jewish people than other communities. And I'm going to say a couple of things that may seem contradictory, but the way I talk about it is like let's just put up a bunch of different Post-it notes and allow for the complexity of the situation. You have Jews of all backgrounds in the United States who are feeling very deeply affected by what's happening in Israel, and what the data tells us is the reaction in some ways is about proximity to relationship to Israel. It's not about race. It's about proximity to relationship with Israel. And we see young Jews of all racial backgrounds, the more distant they are and the fewer relationships they have with people in Israel, the less affection and affinity we see with that. If you look at Pew 2020, the data point of Jews, white Jews, not Jews of color, in Pew 2020, the data point was like something like 30% of Jews under, I think it was age 27, felt strong affinity for Israel. This was not about people of color. This was just the super vanilla data. And so the US Jewish community before October 7th had an Israel problem. Okay, we already had a problem. And if you know the concept of the Overton window shifted already. And in some ways, the US Jewish community was not prepared for it. And so we've spent all of this time, and look, I've been going to Jewish Sunday school since I was 7 years old. I was never taught about Palestine when I went to Sunday school, not once. And the first time I met a Palestinian person, I did not understand. And I'm so embarrassed as a woman of color that I was talking to another woman of color and I did not understand where she was from. I said, oh, you're from Israel. She said, I'm from Palestine. I said, oh, you're from Israel. She said, I'm from Palestine. Because the map that I had when I was in Sunday school never showed anything else. And so, you know, post-1980, as Jews in the United States kind of just like assimilated in, it was pretty good until 2016 in Charlottesville. There was a bit of a lull in our community around educating all Jews and really all people in the US community about atrocities everywhere. There was a lull in our community about educating about the threat of anti-Semitism in the United States because we thought it had waned. It was not waning. And you know who knew that? Jewish people of color. Because we've been experiencing the racism all the way through. And so when we were sort of creating signals around the unrest happening in the United States, a lot of our Jewish colleagues and allies were not paying attention. And in 2016, 2017, my rabbi said to me, he said to me, Ilana, you know, the congregants are like afraid and they're talking about pulling their mezuzahs off their doors. Are you taking your mezuzah? I'm like, I'm never taking my mezuzah down. I'm never taking my mezuzah down because if they're gonna come kill me, they're gonna come kill me because I'm black first or because I'm queer first. They're not coming after me because I'm Jewish, okay? And so it is time that collectively as Jewish Americans and beyond, it's time as people of color, as queers, as women, as Jews, as Muslims, as Baha'i, like everybody, it's time that we collectively understand the larger threat in front of us and that our allegiance to, you know, and to create any kind of like loyalty test about what our affection for Israel is in a context where we have to focus on fighting anti-Semitism domestically. And I understand the threats are connected, but we cannot use a purity test for affection for Israel as a way to gauge if we're going to be in relationship with people who are of different races than us to fight racism and anti-Semitism. We have to be able to be in disagreement about some things and in collective community, in collective movement relationship for other things. And there is a very large white nationalist movement afoot in this country. And we have to understand that by pressing Jews of color, young Jews on college campuses, to pronounce their connections to Israel or their perspectives on Israel and Palestine as a way to sort of test whether or not we want to be in relationship with each other is short-sighted, given that our biggest threat is right here at home.